Hello everyone, how are you guys today? Welcome to the Walter Stern Library. I'm Kurt Asher, I'm the Dean of the Library, and today we're here to listen to one of the community's leading rights advocates, and as well as celebrate Bakersfield and CSUB's Pride Week. I hope everybody got a slice of pizza. Yeah, okay. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to tell you about a few upcoming events in the library. On October 14th at 6, we're co-sponsoring that's Monday, we'll be co-sponsoring a California Writers Series event with award-winning poet Lindsay Wilson. On Tuesday, October 15th, the next day, at 6 p.m., we'll be bringing LA Roots music historian and producer Scott Bomar to campus to discuss the Bakersfield sound. The Bakersfield sound, of course, I hope you know what it is. If you don't, it's country music, kind of indigenous to this region. And he'll be talking about that music from the earliest days to the present. You have to RSVP for that, so go to our website and you can do it. He'll be interviewed by journalist Bob Price. He's a Californian journalist on stage, and they'll be talking about that. It's kind of a coincidence that almost exactly 10 years ago, Bob also conducted an online interview with Merle Haggard on campus, so it's kind of interesting. So please RSVP for that event if you're interested. On Thursday, we'll be hosting Curator Emeritus of Literary Manuscripts from the Huntington Museum and Jack London scholar Sue Hodson at 4 p.m. So it's a pretty busy next few days, next week. So I'm hoping that I'll see a lot of you guys there. We have a sign-up list by the door. You probably thought that was for some kind of class thing. It's not. You can sign up for, for various, to hear about those events in your email. So thank you. And now about our guest, Anne-Natasha Pinckney. Anne earned her undergraduate degree at the University of Alaska at Fairbanks, and her graduate degree in sociology here at CSUB, so she's an alum. She currently works full-time as the Advocacy Services Coordinator for the Center for Sexuality and Gender Diversity, and is a lecturer here at CSUB in the Sociology Department and teaches the LGBTQ Experience in the U.S. each spring semester. And she'll be speaking today about the differences between gender identity and sexual orientation. So let's please welcome our guest.
Okay, good. I was testing it. Well, hi, everybody. Hello. Well, thank you for joining me for lunch. Wow, this sounds really loud right here. You got it? Okay. So thank you for joining during your lunch period. My name is Anne Pinckney, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And as you heard, I am the Advocacy Services Coordinator for the Center for Sexuality and Gender Diversity. So just really quick, what we do. The center was founded in 2011. Downtown, you may have seen it. It's across from Cafe Smitten and has lots of flags. Can't miss it. It actually was founded to be a safe space for those in the LGBTQ community, allies, and families, because there was a suicide, you may remember, in 2010, by Seth Walsh. And that was kind of what prompted our leadership to say we need a visible space, because Seth felt alone, and we never want anybody to feel like they're the only one. And so that was the history of our center. And in 2016, and actually it was volunteer run until 2016, and I was a volunteer for 3 years before I started as a staff member. In 2016, we received a state grant for $1.5 million. Sounds like a lot, woo, but it's over a 5-year period, and most of it, of course, is for staff. So what we do there is at our second location, our annex, we provide counseling services, which I have brochures here about our counseling services, which are free to LGBTQ allies, families, and community members. So please take one, give it to somebody who needs it. If it's not you, you all are welcome for our services. So that's just kind of real quick. And Click too fast. So for this talk today, one of the things I want you to really focus on is understanding the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity, because many times these are conflated within our community. We also want you to gain some basic LGBTQ plus terminology. Now, when you leave this room, this is only 35, 40 minutes. You are not going to be an expert, okay? I am not an expert, and I have been teaching this for over 3 years. So please be aware you're not going to be an expert. But what you will be is familiar. So when somebody tells you their personal identity label, you'll be able to understand and ask appropriate questions, because there are inappropriate questions. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And we also and this was specifically made for organizations. So replace clients with students, coworkers, etc., etc. So when we say understand why supporting LGBT clients is important to you and your organization, if you work for any company, you will work with somebody who identifies as LGBTQ. Okay? And also, we want you to learn how to interact in a positive and respectful manner with those who identify as LGBTQ+. So I usually start with this, and be real. How many have heard, I just don't understand that gay lifestyle? We've heard it. Be real. Yeah. And it's funny because when I teach this, a lot of times I laugh because the people who are part of community a lot of times actually will shake their head more readily than those who aren't, because we've all heard that. And one of the things is because a lot of times people feel like it's like, I shouldn't say that I know. I don't know. You know. So, but please feel free to speak your mind and stop me if you have any questions, okay? But lifestyle basically is a way in which a person lives. So, for example, I want to live a healthy lifestyle. I'm trying to, this Herbalife, and I'm trying to get a little fit and everything like that. That's healthy. That's the lifestyle I want to live. However, my identity is queer. I am a queer woman of color. That is my sexual orientation. It is something, it's how I identify. It's part of who I am. It is not all of who I am. But that's the difference. A person in LGBTQ plus community, it's their identity. They are is part of themselves. Just like if you were identify as Christian or Catholic, I know a lot of people say I'm a good Christian woman. It is part of their identity. It's very similar. Okay? So now here's kind of where we get into the differoences. So sexual orientation, very simply put, is the person you're attracted to. So it could be somebody romantically, emotionally, sexually, or a combination of these. Okay? Your gender identity is how you identify, so how one sees themselves within the world. So I told you, my pronouns are what? Who heard it? And I said I'm a queer woman of color. So I identify as a woman. So my gender identity is female. That's how I see myself. Follow? My sexual orientation is queer. I'm going to explain, and if people are going like this and wincing because of the word, I will explain that word later in the presentation. So, sexual orientation, very simply put, is who you like. Gender identity is who you are. You want to take a pic? Okay, I'm gonna pause for a minute. Uh-oh. And those aren't mine, those are my lines. So a lot of this stuff, people are like, oh, Anne said this and it's great. I said, really, they're not all my lines. This was actually stolen from somebody else. But it was appropriated with permission. All right, so this is your first quiz. So just shout out the answers. What does the L stand for? G. Don't cheat. G. B. I'm just clicking too fast. T. Yeah. And Q. Or, yeah. Ay, this thing is like really super sensitive today. And thank you. What I always listen for on T is to see what people actually say, because we're going to talk about some of the different T's that what it used to stand for again in this presentation as well. And so here's the next question. Are sex and gender different? For anybody who said yes, why?
Because sex is your biological determination, gender is determined for you by someone else?
Okay, so the answer, and that is actually exactly right. Actually, usually people get a little off, and I was thinking, I'm like, nope, actually you got exactly right. So sex is generally a biological determination, and gender is we're going to talk about gender separately, but gender is socially constructed, and we're going to talk about what that means. But starting with sex assigned at birth, we usually say sex assigned at birth because this is when you're born and the doctor catches the baby, based on hardware or plumbing, as we say, they name the child either a or a girl, generally. Now, there are those who are biologically neither, and those folks identify as intersex. Now, back in the day, some of us who are older may have heard the term hermaphrodite. It's the same thing, however, it is not a culturally appropriate word to use anymore. So you might have seen all the Jerry Springer shows and things like that back in the day, and I'm aging myself by saying Jerry Springer, I know, and all those back in the day, they actually used the other term. But the most culturally appropriate term is intersex. So basically this is talking specifically about a baby born with visible anatomy that does not fit neatly in the package of male or female in our binary, okay? So there are approximately 1.7% of births that are identified as intersex babies. Here's the catch. That is not encompassing an entire intersex population, because a lot of folks don't find out they're intersex until they're later in life. And it could be because they have testes that are inside and they've never had an ultrasound to see. And other folks, they may develop breasts and they had a penis. So those kind of things that don't naturally happen until after puberty. Okay? So anybody have any questions on this slide? Okay. So gender is socially constructed. So what do I mean by that? I mean, when we determine that we have a boy or a girl, so we're only thinking within the binary right now, so either or, we generally tell them how to behave. So I know, as a child, they want to put me in dresses. Still don't wear dresses because I don't like them. But that was what was determined was feminine behavior. I was not supposed to climb trees because that was not feminine behavior. So I was taught how to be female. And then there was a lot of things that my mom taught me about understanding what it is to be female in this world and so forth. Same with masculine behaviors. They're taught based on, now this is solely based on your genitalia, how you're taught to be either male or female. Okay? So how we teach somebody is socially constructed. So our gender is thus taught to us. Gender, again going back to gender identity, that doesn't always match the gender that we were taught to be. So my gender identity is female, but how I behave as a female may not be exactly how other people who identify as female behave. Okay, so gender identity is, again, the innermost concept, has nothing to do with how you behave or anything like that. So at least it's two. Gender expression. Okay, so as I said, I don't really like to wear dresses. I have, and sometimes I get a bug, and I said, you know what, I'm going to go wear a dress, and I want to be fabulous in heels and stuff. I mostly do my shoes. If you can't see them, I'll come around later. But I love shoes, but I don't really like the heels, but I love wearing shoes that are just fabulous. My stepsister wears fabulous shoes that are heels. She also, heels. She also is fabulous. Like, she might wear a fabulous dress, and she's like, this is the most comfortable I'm ever at. I'm not comfortable wearing jeans. I'm not comfortable wearing t-shirts. 90% of the time, I'm going to be in jeans and t-shirt because I dress a more neutral gender expression. But when I'm out and doing presentations and stuff, I might have a more feminine presentation. But there are also times I might wear a suit and tie because that's just how I feel like dressing. But that gender expression is more masculine in our tradition, in our society, correct? But it doesn't change my gender identity. I still identify as female, even though my expression may be what we typically might think is more masculine. So you follow? So the reason why this is important is because a lot of our folks in our trans community aren't able to express themselves the way they feel most comfortable. So there are times you might see folks, there might be folks in this room who are trans who are dressed as the sex they were assigned at birth for safety's sake, and because they're not out. But when they go to places, maybe the center downtown, they may dress in the way they feel most comfortable. That really kind of expresses their authentic gender identity. Okay? I don't have my picture, but I do actually have a picture on this one, but on my longer slide, there's a picture of Sarah Ramirez. Does anybody know who she is from Grey's Anatomy? So there's one where she's, of course she's always fabulous, but she has long hair and she wears this dress. And then there's another picture is how she kind of presents more today with a shorter hair, wearing a suit and tie, still looking fabulous. And she identifies the same. And folks say, what? Is she trans? No, she doesn't identify as trans. She still identifies, and she uses her pronouns. She could tell you, and I know she says her gender identity is queer, and her sexuality is the same as well. She's bisexual. She's been bisexual. No matter how she presents, she's still bisexual. Her sexual orientation, okay? So gender identity, we talked a little bit about our trans siblings, and what basically, this is somebody whose gender identity is different than their assigned sex at birth. So we said, sometimes we're born and the doctor catches us and says you're either a male or female. So sometimes that doesn't really fit with a person. And they're like, no, I'm not really male, I'm actually female. Or, I'm not female, I'm really male. So we're still talking within the binary, within one or the other, okay? And so that person may identify as trans, which is the most appropriate way you can say either trans or transgender. It is the most appropriate term you can identify a person who identifies differently than the sex they were assigned at birth. So then we have folks who identify as cisgender. Now, I told you all that I was assigned female at birth. Well, maybe I didn't. I was assigned female at birth, and I identify as female. So I am a cisgender female. So everyone in this room identifies has a gender identity, and everybody in this room also has a sexual orientation. So the reason why cisgender, it's a fairly new term. It's basically a way not to other trans folks. Because either you were trans or you weren't at one point. So it's othered. So instead of othering folks, everyone has a gender identity. Okay? So also, this is where it gets a little confusing, so I'm not going to go too much into it, but just recognize that there are folks who identify outside of that binary, and we're going to get into some other, what gender nonconforming folks, how they identify as well, but there are some folks who identify their gender identity as intersex. So remember, again, this is a biological identity as well, but some folks do identify their gender identity as intersex. A lot of folks who identify as intersex actually will identify as agender, which is without gender or no gender. Okay? But I'm not going to get too much into this, but before we move on, I know cisgender usually confuses folks. Anybody have any questions? Please don't feel shy. Mm-hmm.
Where's the origin of cis, C-I-S?
Latin. It's Latin. That's a great question. I usually say that. Thank you for pointing it out. So it's a Latin root. It means cis, means the same as. Trans means across. So simple, kind of a simple, but that's where the root of that. I know when I first heard cisgender, I asked the same questions because I was like, well, that's a really cool term. And the other thing too is that you might hear it say, somebody says cis men or cis women. You might hear that term as well. And cis is the short version, just like trans is the short version. So you might hear both terms. Okay, so now this is where when I was listening for the T, I was trying to hear to make sure folks may not use the other term, which is transsexual. Now, The thing about transsexual, the reason why it is no longer culturally appropriate is because at one point it was used to identify folks who had had surgical intervention. And that could be any kind of medical intervention to change one's outside to match how they feel on the inside, okay? A trans person, a transgender person does not need to have any kind of medical intervention to identify as trans. Now, I told you there are some questions that may not be appropriate. So for a trans person, two things are never, ever, ever appropriate. First, please never ask somebody what their anatomy is. That's nothing to do with anything. You can ask somebody's pronouns so you can respect them more, but please don't ask about their anatomy. And I was at one training and I heard people laugh like who would ask that? Well, kind of a ridiculous, like that's ridiculous. You say that, but we've actually heard of people, adult folks, asking folks under 18, oh, so you have a vagina then? Like, it was totally inappropriate. And it was not meant to be derogatory when that person asked, but it was still inappropriate. The other thing you don't ask, what was your other name? Never ask somebody's, you go by the name that they're presenting. If somebody tells you their nickname is Johnny, you don't ask, hey, what were you born as? You don't say that. You don't say, oh, were you Jonathan at birth? No. So the same with a trans person. Please just respect what they tell you about themselves. And everybody, you're the expert on yourself. Another sometimes we get confused with is drag queen or drag queen. So everybody say the most famous drag queen. RuPaul, right? So RuPaul is a performance, just a performance. Generally, drag queens, if those who are unfamiliar, drag is more of an entertainment in that it is big hair, big makeup, it's ostentatious, very loud, very gregarious, very all those words. And so it's a performance. A person, and a lot of times also I'm going to make note too, those in the trans community, a lot of times don't really like to see drag performers because they feel it invalidates their identity. That does not mean that drag is not still part of the LGBTQ community. It's just an understanding that I want everybody to have. That because those in the trans community, they identify, so Laverne Cox, who is an open and out trans woman from Orange is the New Black, she goes to bed, she's still Laverne Cox. She wakes up, she's Laverne Cox. All the time, she is Laverne Cox. RuPaul goes to bed as Andre Charles. He uses he/him pronouns in most cases and presents using traditionally masculine clothes outside of his big performances. So drag is a performance. Drag queen, drag king, performances. So a cross-dresser is someone who, and we're going to use the term that you may have heard, because everybody knows it's Halloween and Rocky Horror comes out, and so you know the song. So transvestite is not a culturally appropriate term, even though it's part of that song and it's part of pop culture. Recognize that is not a culturally appropriate word to say, and then the short version of that, which I'm not going to say because I find it highly offensive, is totally not appropriate. And if you don't know, come to me later and I'll let you know. But cross-dresser is the more appropriate term to use. Generally, cross-dressers are folks who are identified as heterosexual men who have a fetish with maybe they wear underwear under their outfit and things like that, and they also those who are cross-dressers generally have different bars or different locations they go to present, but they're not drag queens. They're not actually doing it for entertainment value, but they identify as male. So 90%, this is not all folks who identify as cross-dressers, okay? So any questions of this slide before I move on? Okay. So again, we've been talking about within that binary between male and female. We're going to talk about outside of that binary. So outside of that binary, There are those who identify as gender nonconforming, gender non-binary, gender neutral, or gender fluid. We have one of our coworkers actually identifies as neutral, and they use pronouns of they, them. And I know even in the schools, because I've talked to some professors who have a hard time using they, them pronouns. First of all, just to tell you, we use it all the time anyway. So when we don't know the gender of somebody, we might say, what was their name again? Oh, Jim and them, they went to the store. You're only talking about one person. It's a thing, it's practicing. It's really just getting, for me, what I do is when I'm driving, instead of saying, oh, why did she cut me off? Or why did he cut me off? I say, why did they cut me off? Man, I don't know who they are. Why would they do that? So I try to use more gender neutral thinking to start with, and so it's easier for me to understand when you change pronouns. So for me, actually, I come from a place of neutral. So a lot of times, even in my notes, because I'm a counselor and I write notes, I'll put they instead of he or she a lot of times because I'm so used to coming from a neutral place as far as with pronouns, not assuming somebody's gender. So that's really what this slide is about, is understanding that there are folks who may not take a gender, who don't identify as male nor female. They may present, however, female, or they may present male. But their identity, how they feel inside about themselves, is neutral. Going back to how I said that I could wear a suit and tie and still identify as female. It's the same principle, okay? And fluid, a lot of folks who, their gender identity may change over a lifetime. So they may identify as male one day, female another. But with that, some folks present differently when they feel different. Others will tell you, no, today I identify as Kate. Tomorrow, and then the next day I'm Kurt, because you're here. I'm just using a name, using random names. But you see what I'm saying? So the fluidity, somebody could identify that way. All right. So that's really just understanding outside the binary. Any questions on this? I'm going to talk about pronouns on one more slide, so that's why I'm just kind of glancing over this one. Well, go ahead.
I have a trans friend who's pretty adamantly against this sort of thing because he feels that he felt like a guy ever since he could think that way.
Sure.
And he said that when people are gender fluid, it's almost like a choice and it invalidates them, similar to how the drag performances kind of invalidate them.
Interesting. It's interesting that you say that, because it's kind of, when I talk to folks who identify as gender fluid, the one thing they say to me is, a lot of folks invalidate them by saying you invalidate their identity. So it's within the trans community, there are different opinions, ideas. I often tell people this, I'm not here to change hearts. I'm not here to change minds. What I'm here is to give you information so you understand how folks identify. So just remember, though, that particular argument invalidates somebody's gender. So if my colleague was standing here, you would have just invalidated their gender identity. You see? Not on purpose. But you hear what I'm saying. That argument.
I just want to know what I could say to them, not to change their mind because that's kind of useless.
Right.
But it's not my view, and I just don't know why it is in my view. I'm trying to put the words behind what I thought.
And maybe the word is, that seems kind of interesting in that you're invalidating somebody else's gender identity. And you could say the same thing I say often is, I'm not here to change your view or your heart. I'm just saying that this is how this person identifies. I don't necessarily agree with what you said about their identity because I feel like that invalidates them. So something in those matters, something in that respect. And the other thing I also tell people is sometimes it's best not to finish the conversation. If you're like, this conversation, I feel like this conversation is not going to go anywhere, let's go ahead and we're going to end this conversation. I would like to give you more information and more education. And at the end of this, again, I'll invite others to come contact me and we can have further conversations about those particular questions. That's a great question. Great question. So moving forward into diversity. So now we've been talking all about identity. Now we're going to talk about a little bit of the BQ and the plus. So this is our sexual orientation. So in our community, trans folks and bisexual folks are often the most marginalized, even within the LGBTQ plus population. Because in the bisexual plus population, a lot of times it's because folks are like, don't understand and say, kind of the same argument, you're invalidating us by being bisexual. You need to choose or be your true self. You know you're gay or you know you're straight. You need to choose. So it's kind of the same kind of argument about folks who identify as neutral or who are attracted to traditionally both genders. How we now interpret, or a lot of folks who identify as bisexual interpret this as saying, I'm attracted to more than one gender, or my gender and another gender. And so that's why we use the term bi plus. It's kind of that umbrella term. Pansexual is very similar to bisexual. And this is actually the P, because we've actually had people in other trainings ask, hey, I've heard the P stands for pedophile. No, it does not. It stands for pansexual. It will never stand for pedophile. And so a pansexual person is one who's attracted to all identities and genders. So why is that easier for folks to take as an identity than bisexual? Because bi, again, talks about our binary within the two. So a lot of folks who identify as gender nonconforming or outside of that binary, a lot of times it's easier for them to say, you know what, I'm attracted to more than one gender, so pansexual, or I'm attracted to all genders, or regardless of genders, fits me better than bisexual, because I'm outside of that binary myself. Follow? Good. All right. So this is also one that a lot of folks have confusion with, is asexual or ace. So this is someone who does not necessarily experience physical attraction. This does not mean they don't experience romantic love. Okay, so this is hard because folks are like, really? What? Why? Oh, they don't want sex? Yes, that's exactly what it means. So somebody who when they look at you, so if I would be Chris, I would say, hey, how you doing? I'm looking for the person. I'm not looking at the attraction and physicals. When we meet somebody, right, what do? We generally like, how you doing? Based on how they look, right? But a person who's asexual would just go, hey, how are you doing? I want to get to know you. Wow, you teach over here too? Wow, that's awesome. So that's the attraction that we're looking for. And eventually that could lead into a relationship which is based on romantic love. So think of it more of, if you're in a long-term relationship, how after a while sex becomes not the main thing in your relationship because you have so much other stuff happening in life. It's more like that. They start there. They don't end there after years and years. However, that does not mean they won't ever have sex. So there are folks who identify, and this is to throw this term out there, demisexual, who will have sex with people if they find that they have an emotional connection with them. So there are folks who identify as asexual overall, who might say, if I fall in love with them, I may consider having a physical relationship. And so queer, I told you I would get back to queer. So queer basically means this, simply put, under sexual orientation, I know I'm not straight. If you're using it for gender identity, I know I'm not cisgender. And what does cisgender mean? Exactly. I identify as the same sex I was assigned at birth, right? So I'm either not straight or I'm not cisgender if you're talking about gender identity. For questioning, now before I go to questioning, queer is not accepted universally throughout everybody in the community. There are those who have been beat and hurt by this word severely, and this is traumatizing. Know your space is what I tell people, so you can report. So if you leave from here and say, Anne reports or says she identifies as queer, you're reporting my sexuality, you're not calling me queer. Okay? And so the questioning term was actually used to kind of replace queer at one point. A lot of folks don't like questioning because, again, it feels like the choices, the idea of this might be a choice, right? But questioning means, if you think of it like this, I'm questioning what you taught me about my gender identity and my sexual orientation. So we have the assumption that children are straight and cisgender, correct? And if you don't believe me, remember at the playground, oh, is that your little boyfriend? Oh, is that your little girlfriend? We've all seen it. We've all said it. It's okay. And that's the thing, is recognizing that the assumption that people, that's why we have to come out, because there's an assumption that you're straight and cisgender. Okay, so again, this is not all the Q and not all the plus, but I'm going to give you a few more minutes at the end to kind of ask questions. I know we're running tight. So basically, being lesbian and gay was determined not to be a mental illness in 1973. And that rings a bell for me because my older brother was born in 1973. So it's in his lifetime, it was still considered, being lesbian or gay was considered a mental illness. And you would be castrated, you could be chemically castrated, you would be put in asylums. There's all kinds of things that could happen if you came out as lesbian or gay before then. And being transgender or gender nonconforming was determined to be an illness until 2012. So you were assigned the diagnosis of gender identity disorder to get any kind of trans services before 2012. However, what we did determine is a mental health concern is dysphoria. So gender dysphoria is basically when you're outside, this distress you feel when you're outside does not match your inside. So it's what we hear a lot of our trans males say, they want to cut off their breasts, and they try. They've tried. Same with trans females trying to cut their penis off, and they've tried. And this is not just older people. We have kids that are 6 that tried. Then they know that they're not male. So the dysphoria is real, and that is what a lot of folks are working with when we work with clients. Sometimes it helps to have medical intervention. A lot of times people go with hormones treatments, and that helps. Other time, or dressing, expressing themselves more in their authentic gender. Other times, it's more of understanding, you know, where they're at and what they want to do, because not every trans person has the means or the motivation or the want to transition physically. Okay, so not everybody wants to transition. Not everybody has Caitlyn Jenner's money either. So that's to be clear. So this is your second test. All right, so you're going to say the LGBTQ, and you're going to put where they go, either sexual orientation or gender identity. Okay, you ready? Just yell it out. L goes where? G? Oh, it's already there. J, too quick. B? T? Q? Yes, this is a great crowd. All right, now here's the plus. So where do these fit? All right, A, gender, where do you think it fits? Straight. Oh! Where does straight go? Yeah. Pansexual? Gender non-binary? Cisgender? Asexual? Intersex? Good. Good. This was a great crowd. Excellent. So very, 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 very quickly, pronouns. It breaks down to this. You don't always know somebody's pronouns just by looking at them. Asking and correctly using someone's pronouns is one of the basic ways to show your respect for their gender identity. If you slip up, it's best to say something right away like, sorry, I meant, and then insert the correct pronoun. And the most common pronouns are she, her, hers, he, him, his, and they, them, theirs. So, I'm going to address some of the questions that you may have because I've heard some of the questions and I'm going to address them already. So part of the questions I've heard is, I don't always feel comfortable just going up to somebody and say, hey, Chris, my name is Anne, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. What are yours? That feels a little much, right? Feels a lot, right? That's a lot. Don't do that. But what you can do is say, hi, how are you doing? Great. You know, so I can respect you the most, I just want to make sure I get your pronouns. What are your pronouns? And they look at you like this, go, oh, my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Oh, yes. I actually had that happen at a grocery store, and I thought I read their name wrong, and I think I used the wrong pronouns, and I said, you know, what are your pronouns? And they looked like this, and I said, mine are she, her, and hers. Oh, I'm she, her, you know what, don't worry about it. And then blah, blah, blah. We were chatting the rest of the time. I got the best service because she found that I respected her identity by asking her because she's been mistaken her gender identity so many times. So just remember, you don't always know. The other thing you can ask in polite settings, is it okay if I call you sir? Is it okay if I call you ma'am? You know, those kinds of things, like very general questions, and they'll tell you yes or no. So that's the easiest way. And then please don't go on and on. Oh, God, it's so hard for me. Why do you have to use they, them pronouns? Can I just call you something? No, it's not on them. Pause. I'm sorry. I meant, and move on. Okay? So I know pronouns are a little bit tough, but anybody have any quick questions on that one? Okay. So why do you care? You've been sitting here for, I don't know, why do you care? So establish an environment where people respect each other and their differences. It eliminates her experience of discrimination and harassment. It displays respect for the other person. It allows people to be more open and honest. It helps persons who identify as LGBTQ feel more safe. It encourages more people to comply with instructions. So if I'm a teacher, a professor here, and I keep misgendering somebody, are they going to do what I'm asking? Or are they just going to zone in on you? Yeah, they're shut down. They're gone. So just remember that. And next step is respect your clients and your coworkers. So try and use their correct name and gender pronouns. So you wouldn't necessarily go and say, hey, if somebody's name is Tommy and you're calling him Tim or Timmy, that's probably not going to really work out very well. So use the correct name and gender pronouns. Try not to speak only in the binary of male or female, or assume straight or gay. Or if somebody asks your spouse, I've literally had this question before, hey, are you married? Yeah. What's your husband's name? Kathy. So really they're like, oh, well, that's not a male name. No, it is not. And so we go into this question, so it can be embarrassing for folks. So don't assume who somebody might be married to. The other thing is to be aware of the more you start creating a more affirming environment within your spaces that you're in, more people are going to start to come out to you. Remember, you might be the first person that person has come out to, okay? So we just ask. Again, listen, respect, and affirm them. That's it. All right, now it's time for questions. Any questions? Do we have a mic? Awesome.
Okay.
Oops. Back to my question slide.
Does anyone have any questions?
Oh, come on, you do. I feel like there's questions there.
No? Nothing? Sure? You look like you have a question to me. You. No?
I feel some questions. I do. I feel like people are shy. Don't worry, this is a safe space.
I have a question about transitioning, what it means exactly.
Yes.
What exactly does it mean? You hear it all the time. It's not ever clear. Exactly what they mean when people are described as, I think sometimes it might be used as just a general statement for trans people, even though they may not be, right? Getting, like you said, surgically altered. So, am I right about that?
Yes. And so transitioning is different for different people, right? So transitioning could mean I am going to start presenting as my authentic gender. It could also, again, it does not necessarily have to be medical transitioning, but a lot of folks include that when they start their hormone therapy. And the difference is that a lot of times with insurance and things like that, there are a lot of hoops that trans folks have to jump through. And again, it's a lot of feeling of othering. So a lot of folks don't want to necessarily go through the medical transitions right away, but they may start presenting and using a different name. So, for example, if I was transitioning and I told you all that my name was Todd, I may present here in what was traditionally more masculine, but I may or may not be on hormone therapy. So it's just basically telling folks who I am and asking you to use the he, him pronouns for me. Mm-hmm.
So that could be similar to the process of coming out in some ways then.
Exactly. So the question was that could be similar to, in some ways, to coming out. And yes, it can. So a lot of folks, especially trans folks, say they have two coming outs. So one coming out could be their sexual orientation. A lot of times folks come out as gay first because gay and lesbian is what people understand in the more general terms. Like I had one person I'm thinking of in particular who came out as lesbian but said, I'm attracted to guys though. But it's the only term they could understand to tell their parents. So when they came out as their actual self, they're like, no, I'm transmasculine. I'm a man. And so they actually have these second layers of coming out. And so if you think about that, how stressful it is to come out in the first place, and even if it's a good coming out experience, it can be seriously stressful because you work this up in your head. You have everything that somebody's going to say, and they may or may not say that. But you have a really hard time coming out. So if you're coming out twice, think about that. So yeah, definitely a similar experience.
Thank you. First off, thank you for doing this. This is great work. It's necessary work. My question is, I have a student who came out to me as queer. Mm-hmm. Two questions. What does that mean? And then how, if at all, can I honor that person as an instructor?
Mm-hmm. Okay. And thank you. So queer, going back means I'm not straight if they're talking about their sexual orientation. So queer simply means I'm not straight. Or if they're talking about their gender identity, it's I'm not cisgender. And cisgender, I know you came a little late, so cisgender means I identify as the same sex I'm assigned at birth. Okay? So in those terms, that's how queer is meant. A lot of times, folks who don't like labels will use queer. So queer is, it feels labelless in that I'm part of the queer community. So I know I'm not part of the straight community. I'm not part of the mainstream community. I'm queer. I'm part of the queer community. So a lot of folks will say that as the community they're part of as well. Again, queer is not accepted by everyone in the population, in the LGBTQ population. So one of the things we said was you can report. So saying that student, I have a student who identifies as queer, that is correctly the way to say it. Instead of saying, I have a student who's queer. You know, you're not calling them queer, you're reporting that that's how they identify. It kind of makes sense a little bit? Did I help a little bit? Okay. You're welcome. Oh, all right, 2 questions.
We are streaming, so that's why I want people to use the mic.
Oh, okay. So my first question is, I have students who've asked, and you look at research and things like that, and before it was easy to explain a little bit easier, I think, to say, okay, well, the L, the G, and the B were for orientation, and then the T and the Q were usually for gender identity, right? But then when you get into the plus, then it goes back to how we were saying it's this one and this one and this one and this one. So now I know to be able to explain that better, but when I'm finding resources online and things like that, and research, like it's not as accurate.
Right.
And so if especially for me, if I'm quoting or citing or publishing, how do we make sure, or where do we go to get that right? That's my first question.
Okay. You want to do the first
Okay.
question first? Or
Yes.
Okay.
Because it's a completely different.
Okay. So in my class, I used to, this is queer theory. So this is queer, a graphic history, because I like pictures. And then I use finding out. Now, the thing about finding out is really hard to find a textbook that is about the LGBTQ plus community. This is actually the newer version of it. It's slimmed down, but they don't always use the T correctly. So just beware. And that's a good question, because a lot of times in online sources, they do use the T incorrectly. They don't use trans or transgender. They fluctuate between transgender and transsexual often. And so they're not the newest, and they might be newer sources. The most for study, you could use these as good references, but the other thing is looking for .orgs. Try not to use Wikipedia as much. So like intersex.org will tell you a lot about intersex persons from an intersex person point of view. Asexual.org kind of the same thing. Bisexual.net is similar. So looking for those kind of sources, it would be what I would suggest. And this is for everybody who's researching. Those kind of sources are the most reliable. And also, because remember, the community members, so just kind of going back to our earlier question, within community members, we still have these kind of, in disagreements as well. So you can ask a community member, but remember that it may not be cited, it may not be everybody's opinion within the community. So you can, if you're using somebody's ideas or something like that, just put, I spoke to several community members who identify this way, and this is how it came up, and this is how they said, this is what their opinion is on that. But as far as getting more facts, this is a good textbook because it goes through history and things like that. This one, and this is the kind of history we get in school. We don't get in school when we're supposed to. So, but this one is queer history, and anything on queer theory is actually very reliable. Okay.
Okay, and then the other question is, students in my, we have a student organization on campus, and we're always talking about how we identify. And a lot of them are saying, wait, I'm bi. Well, or am I pan? Or am I bi or am I pan? And so the question is it okay to still be sexually attracted to trans and identify as bi? So that's my...
So yes, that's a great question. And actually, I'm laughing because this is another, we talk about internal debates within the community. So we actually had a presentation last year at the center called Bi, Pan, what's the difference? They had somebody who identifies as bi and somebody who identifies as pan, and they actually had a full conversation about that and presentation. So when we do that again, I'll try and make sure we get that information to the teachers so they can pass it to the students. But basically, yes, because they're personal identity labels. So going back to, let's go back to our diversity slide. Just because I have given you, if I can get back, just because I have given you examples of what these might mean does not mean it's the same for everybody. So people who identify as bisexual, as we said, sometimes have the bi plus, which means I'm attracted to my gender and another gender, or I'm attracted to more than one gender. So you can identify any way that feels comfortable to you. We said that a lot of people like to use pansexual because they're not in the binary. And a lot of our trans siblings, that's how they feel, because they're not attracted necessarily just to gender. They're attracted to the person who happens to be male or female, or who happens to be neither, or more than one gender. So those kinds of things. So a lot of folks find that pansexual fits them better. All these are personal identity labels, and there's more. So like folks in our Two-Spirit community, who are Native American from North, I just found this out, I did a training, North American tribes only, so that's only, and it only means United States and Canada tribes. You have to be of that tribe, one of those tribes, and it means to be queer, basically. So it means sexual orientation and gender identity. It's not just that you identify as a trans person translated over to Native American culture. And Two-Spirit is actually a name that replaced a derogatory name that was given to the tribes by the French. So in every culture, they have a different name for folks who identify as Two-Spirit. So it's a very interesting, so the reason why these lists keep going is because there's more ways to identify. And then there's a lot of folks who thought they were straight. I've gone to places and they said, I'm straight attracted, so I'm attracted romantically to folks of the opposite gender, but I identify as demisexual. So it can be played with. It could be bi-aromantic, pan-aromantic. I can keep going. But the reason why is because every label means something to the person.
So I don't really know how to ask this question.
Okay.
So what's the difference between like transsexual and like transgender, and just because I hear like like my family members, they're trying to be more like informative about things, and I want to be able to kind of like, if they do have questions that I could answer, like
Sure.
be able to answer them and make sure that they're using terms correctly, because a lot of times I hear them intertwining the two, and I'm not 100% sure if because I don't think that they're the same thing. So I'm just wondering like what the difference between the two are.
Okay. And so transgender is the most culturally appropriate term, or trans, to use right now. So that's the easiest way to explain it up front. The difference is transsexual used to imply surgery. So somebody who had some kind of medical intervention. Transgender is for someone who identifies differently than the sex they were assigned at birth. So transgender is, again, trans means a cross, so cross gender. Cisgender means the same as. So when you're saying transsexual, it's to change the outside to represent the inside.
So that would be like post.
Yes, but it's still not appropriate. And let me tell you why. Because a person does not need to have any kind of medical or surgical intervention to identify as trans or transgender. And transsexual is one of those terms that some folks will say, I'm a transsexual female. I have actually heard it with older folks in our community. Again, it goes back to the queer in reporting. I can report, just like I just told you, older people have said they identify as. I'm not calling that person a transsexual. Kind of, okay? All right? You're welcome. Any other questions? I love this bag, by the way. It's like awesome. It's like this blue, like old looking kind of thing. It's really cool. I'm gonna steal it though.
Hi.
Hey.
So this happened a while ago, but I was writing a paper and I used they, them pronouns,
Right.
but my teacher said that was grammatically incorrect. And so I didn't know like what to do in that situation, so
It is
I don't
not.
know.
Exactly. The Webster's Dictionary has updated that. But in context, if you were using they, them pronouns, and you were able to explain that you're talking about a gender-neutral person, they still can use, you can use they, them pronouns for that person. Up here, I actually have a gender pronoun because I have a friend. It's not enough for everybody, but if I get down to one, I can send somebody to maybe make a couple more copies. But there's some gender pronouns. Yeah, you can take pictures of it as well. But zir, there's other gender-neutral pronouns that you probably could have used, and then they would have still said it was incorrect. But according to Webster's Dictionary now, and they've updated the grammatical rules, they, them pronouns are appropriate to use for one person. And how do you conjugate it? The exact same way that you would for two. So John went down to the store. They said they needed to get something for themselves. I don't know, but like something like that. So all the sentences is constructed the same. Everybody gets confused. It's not different. It's exactly the same.
Can I respond to?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I think I can you just pass that now?
Absolutely.
So I work for the university, and at the system-wide level, those conversations have been happening in terms of using they, them, theirs for official documents. And what we've done is we had a lot of great conversation, I think, with a group of students from Humboldt State as to how to incorporate and make the language more inclusive. And what we've done is just put footnotes and documents where those terms are being used, just to explain why we're using them and using it as a knowledge tool also as we're having those conversations.
Absolutely. That is actually the best. I think that's probably the best way to do it, especially in your paper, to let your professor know that you're not being grammatically incorrect. You're intentionally using this language. It's like if you're intentionally using slang from a region and you're doing it on purpose. You're putting in quotes. You're using it. You're intentionally using it. It's the same way when you're doing at an academic level. So thank you for that. That's a really great suggestion.
All right, well, our time's about up, so thank you very much for coming, and we want to give a big round of applause to our guest, Natasha, or Anne.
And it's fun. Yeah.
Also, there's a lot of pizza left, so take some with you, all right?
And just so you also know, I teach this in the spring.
Oh, right.
The full thing in the spring. So LGBTQ Experience is a sociology class. It's an elective. If y'all would like to take it, feel free. And I have a lot of spaces in my in-class one. It's more exciting. All right.